What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, diving into some commons and uncommons from murders like Karlov Manor that I do think are something to be looking out for when it comes to open impacts of the set. Overall, from me playing in the sealed over the weekend for the pre-release events, these cards kind of stood out and definitely seemed like they could see some legs in more of a competitive constructed deck, like in standard and stuff like that. With that being said, let's just dive into the cards and let's just start talking about them. The first card up is going to be Not My Watch. This is a card I was quite impressed with over the weekend. This is definitely something I do think that will translate into standard just because it being a 2-mana instant speed spell that exiles target attacking creature. It's kind of like that Wandering Emperor effect, but for a lot cheaper mana. It is definitely something that will slot into a lot of decks, into control decks, into mid-range decks, and maybe even into aggro decks that are looking for that little bit of spot removal in the early game to make way for their attack into your opponent. Overall, very high on this card. Definitely something I would say you want to craft and or collect when it comes to open impacts of this set. Overall, very high on this card, and definitely think this will see a ton of play in standard. The next card up is going to be Long Goodbye. This is another card that is quite powerful, I think, overall, especially in the current standard. This is a spell that can't be countered. It destroys target creature or planeswalker with converted mana cost 3 or less. I think this card is good and very strong just because it gets around ward, and I do think that's kind of the one problem a lot of people have, especially in the early game when your opponent's setting up. They're playing some creatures that are quite strong. They then have a ward on them, and typically, as you're developing your mana, you typically don't have that mana to also continue to develop your board as well as deal with the creature that's on the battlefield that may have ward, and that's why this card is very good. I think the only downside to it is just going to be a matter of how many is the right number of this card do I need in my deck, right? We have things like Go for the Throat. We have things like Cut Down. We have things like Shieldred's Edict. We have to kind of figure out what's the right balance of all those things. And that is the only downside. Everything else is all upside. It's, another great removal spell that Mono Black now has in their arsenal. And it's definitely something to keep an eye out for if you're a player who's playing Mono Black or if you're a player who's playing against Mono Black. This is definitely something you will see probably played against you, especially if you have creatures with ward. And if the meta develops that people are still playing a ton of things with ward, this will definitely be a very strong removal spell in that kind of meta. Overall, another card very high on. Definitely going to be very playable and definitely going to be very good for the future of standard, even when the other spells eventually rotate out of the format. The next card up is going to be Demand Answer. This is a 2-mana instant speed spell that has additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or discard a card, and then you draw 2 cards. I think having this flexibility of being able to sacrifice an artifact instead of discarding a card makes this card very good. It makes this card much better than like a card like Thrill of Possibilities, which typically you have to discard a card and you draw 2 cards. Having that additional effect of being able to sacrifice an artifact instead makes this card much stronger, because there are times when you maybe don't have any cards in hand, you only have this card, and then you don't have a way to discard a card in order to draw 2 cards. Allowing you to be able to sacrifice an artifact to draw 2 cards is going to be very good. It does have to probably go into the right deck in terms of constructed play, just because you have to have ways of generating artifacts in order to sacrifice to get the secondary effect to make this card that much better. But overall, another good card. Definitely a very solid common, I would say. This set has kind of a lot of commons that will really mostly be seen in a limited play, but to me, this is kind of one of the commons that stood out and probably could see play in more of a constructed format. The next card up is going to be Get a Leg Up. This is another card that kind of impressed me overall from what it's trying to do. It being a 1-mana instant speed spell that buffs target creature +1/+1 for each creature you control and gives it reach makes this card very good and very versatile. Is it going to be a card that is going to probably be used a lot for defensively? Maybe, but I think for the most part, this is going to be one of those cards when you get a very wide board, especially in a deck that generates a ton of tokens, and you go for a big attack, you can then buff one of your tokens that gets unblocked and get in for a bunch of damage that maybe your opponent wasn't expecting. It being only 1 mana makes it very good and very versatile. I do think this is going to be a very good card in general. It's something that is very playable. It is something that will scale based on how big your board state is in general. And worst case scenario, you do have to play defensively and block a creature in there that maybe your opponent didn't think you had a way of dealing with. So overall, I do think this card could be good. It's definitely going to be a card I'm going to mess around with, especially in decks that will generate tokens, and kind of see how effective this card really could be. But overall, very, very solid card. The next card up is going to be Hard Hitting Question. This is a 1-mana sorcery. Target creature control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker we don't control. I like this card. I do think this card is pretty solid overall. Sure, it's sorcery speed, so it's not effective as in maybe an instant speed spell, but I do like the idea that this spell only does cost 1 mana and it can target creatures and planeswalkers. Whereas I think typically this effect usually only is able to target creatures, making this card a little bit more flexible in that stance, which I think makes up for the fact that it is sorcery speed. I do think this is probably another card that, the mono green deck or maybe a Gruul deck or something like that is missing to make that deck overall effective. Yet again, it works probably very well in any sort of deck that can get very big very quickly. You doing this effect with like a 7/6 dinosaur or something like that is going to be very powerful, especially in the early game. It will deal with a lot of things on the battlefield for the most part. Overall, very good card. I do think, like I said, this will be a card that will see tons of play just because it costs 1 mana, and it's going to be something that will be very, very good as some sort of removal in decks that want to go with large creatures and deal a lot of damage. The next card up is going to be Buried in the Garden. This is a 4-mana enchant land. When it enters the battlefield, we exile target non-land permanent we don't control until it leaves the battlefield. And then whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional mana of any one color, making this card as another good effect of ramping you up a little bit. I do think this will be a card that probably this Leslie Enchantments deck will probably mess around with. Not sure how many copies that deck will have, but yet again, it's a 4-mana enchantment that has kind of an upside benefit. It kind of ramps that deck. It also kind of allows them to remove things on the battlefield and put it on a land, which is sometimes hard to deal with, especially the matchup depending on what they're playing. But overall, very, very good card. It's not something you're going to be playing 4 copies of, but it's definitely something you maybe in like the enchantment deck, maybe play 2 copies of to have additional way of removing things from the battlefield and getting a little bit of mana ramp in the process. Overall, very good card. Definitely something I think we'll see some play here in Standard. The next card up is a very obvious one, I think, if you have seen all the cards from this set, and that card's going to be Lightning Helix. I think this card's going to be very impactful in Standard just in general, just because of how powerful this card is for 2 mana. It deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life, making this card super effective at what it's trying to do. It is something that is quite very strong, especially in that Boros deck. I'm sure there's a Boros deck out there that would be like, oh, they saw this card and they're like, yes, I'm putting that card into my deck. Overall, this is a very good card. It's a very iconic card for Magic as well. It does have that moment in Magic history where someone top decks Lightning Helix, and then it's the whole scream like, oh my god, it's Lightning Helix. Overall, very good card, definitely a very strong card, and I definitely say if you're in these colors, you definitely want to be playing this kind of card if you're looking for some additional ways of dealing damage to your opponent, or maybe some additional ways of gaining life as well. The next card up is going to be No More Lies. This is a blue-white instant speed spell that counters target spell unless controller pays 3. If the spell is countered this way, exile instead of put it into its owner's graveyard. Overall, very strong counter spell, I think, in any format that this card exists in. It's very good in the early game. Once your opponent starts building up mana, that pays 3 gets a little bit worse, but yet again, it's kind of more effective, I would say, in certain decks that may not play a ton of creatures, where they may be playing things like Make Disappear, but never always have a source to actually sacrifice it to maybe get 2 copies of Make Disappear. I do think this card will kind of fill in that slot just because it kind of does it for 3 instead of 2, so a little bit harder for your opponent to pay for it. And I think the upside here as well, the spell gets exiled instead of going to the graveyard, so if your opponent has any sort of recursion, this card is not going to be able. This card will stop that card from being able to come back in the later game if you do counter it. Overall, a very strong spell. Definitely something that probably will see tons of play in blue-white control. Probably see maybe here and there, maybe in something a little bit more of an Esper shell. But overall, this is definitely a very strong card. Definitely very good, very effective. Mana Leak for the longest time was a very strong card, and this is kind of like Mana Leak Plus. Not as flexible because it is a blue-white casting cost, but definitely something that we'll see play just because it counters any spell for 2 mana unless they pay 3. So definitely very good compared to other 2 mana counter spells that we currently have. The next card up is going to be Repulsive Mutation. This is an X blue-green spell where you put X +1/+1 counters based on how much you pay for X. Then you counter up to 1 target spell unless its controller pays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. So basically, this is a better counterspell than the previous one if you're in blue-green, just because it is something that will scale based on the board state, though the only thing here that kind of makes it maybe a little bit worse than the last spell is the fact that you actually have to have a board state in order to actually have this spell be effective. If you have no creatures on the battlefield, no matter how much you pay for X, it's not going to do anything, but you have to have at least 1 creature on the battlefield, making your opponent have to pay that X based on its power overall. I like this spell. It's definitely something, I do think if you're playing in a blue-green deck that is kind of lacking, typically, Make Disappear is like an okay spell, but you never really want to sacrifice a creature to kind of get 2 copies of Make Disappear. I think having a spell that kind of scales based on your strongest creatures is a pretty interesting way to do a counter spell, and this is a very good version of said spell. And the best case, worst case scenario, you pay 0 and you counter target spell unless your opponent can pay 3 to whatever your strongest creature is, making the spell still very effective even if you don't pay anything for that X mana. The next card up is going to be Soul Search. This is a 2 mana black-white spell, sorcery speed. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it, exile that card. If the mana value is 1 or less, create a 1/1 white-black spirit creature token with flying. I think the first effect of this is kind of the most important part here. Being able to get information on your opponent's hand, making them exile a card, either disrupting maybe their following turn, or maybe disrupting maybe their late game, if that's what they kept in their opening hand, is quite effective. Maybe not in the best of 1 stance, just because the format is a little bit faster. Is, exiling a card on turn 2 really effective if you're playing like a deck like Mono Red? Probably not, but definitely something you probably include a couple copies of if you're probably playing like an Orzhov control deck or an Esper control deck. This is definitely quite effective at what it's trying to do. I do think 2 mana is very good. There's no loss of life in the process. The card gets exiled, so there's no way of recurring that card back onto the battlefield at any point, making this quite good in that stance. Overall, I'm very high on this card. Definitely something I will probably mess around with adding a couple copies of, probably put in an Esper shell or maybe an Orzhov shell that I come up with. But overall, a very effective card for what it's trying to do. With that being said, that is going to wrap it up here for the kind of like cards that I think will stand out when it comes to commons and uncommons from Murders at Karlov Manor. There are probably a couple cards that I feel like were more on the fringe play that I probably didn't include on this list, but if you have any cards that I didn't go over that you are kind of high on, let me know in the comments below. It definitely one of those things that I kind of want to hear from you guys, see what you guys think based on what you think of the set overall. If you want to see me do videos like this live, I actually record videos like this on my Twitch stream. That's twitch.tv/thescartv if you want to go check that out. I'll have a link down in the description below if you want to leave the channel a follow and know when I go live. But with that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video.